Welcome to Latchkey History, and welcome to 1812, the Forgotten American War. In the grand timeline of history, the War of 1812 often gets treated like a mere footnote, or worse, it was largely a strange, confusing sequel to the American Revolution that nobody quite remembers the plot to. But if we look closer, it wasn't just a minor skirmish. It was the crucible that actually forged the United States. It was a war of miscommunications, embarrassing failures, legendary resilience, and a final battle that technically didn't even need to happen. To understand the United States as we know it today, we have to go back to a time when the country was still a fragile experiment, caught between two global titans, France and Great Britain. To understand why this war started, we have to look at Europe. In the early 1800s, the continent was tearing itself apart in the Napoleonic Wars. You had France under Napoleon trying to conquer Europe, and Great Britain trying to stop him. The United States, a neutral trading nation, was caught in the middle. Both sides were blocking American trade to starve the other out, but the British were doing something much worse: impressment. Imagine you are an American sailor on a merchant ship. Suddenly, a massive British warship pulls alongside you. British officers board your vessel, line up the crew, and pick men out of the line, claiming they are British deserters. They drag them off to serve in the Royal Navy against their will. While some were actually deserters, thousands of others were innocent Americans. To the British, fighting for their survival against Napoleon, this was a necessity. To Americans, this was kidnapping and a blatant violation of national sovereignty. Simultaneously, tensions were boiling over on the American frontier. As settlers pushed west into the Ohio Valley and Indiana Territory, they faced stiff resistance from Native American confederacies. The British in Canada were supplying these tribes with weapons and supplies, hoping to create a buffer state to protect Canada. In Congress, a group of young, aggressive politicians known as the War Hawks, men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, had enough. They argued that British insults to American sovereignty and their support of Native American resistance could only be answered with war. They also saw a golden opportunity. With Britain distracted by Napoleon, the U.S. could invade and seize Canada. On June 18, 1812, with the rallying cry "Free Trade and Sailors' Rights," President James Madison signed the Declaration of War. It was the first time the United States had ever declared war on another nation, and it passed by the slimmest margin in history. The House passed it 79 to 49, and the Senate by a narrower 19 to 13. The war began with a mixture of hubris and disaster. The basic American strategy was simple: march north and take Canada. Former President Thomas Jefferson famously remarked that the conquest of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. He was wrong. The U.S. military was small, poorly funded, and relied heavily on undisciplined state militias, who often refused to cross state lines. When the Americans launched a three-pronged invasion of Canada, it failed spectacularly. On August 16th in Detroit, American General William Hull was so terrified by the British and their Native American allies, led by the brilliant Shawnee leader Tecumseh and British General Isaac Brock, that he surrendered Fort Detroit, its garrison of 2,500 men, and the entire Michigan Territory, without firing a shot. Instead of a mere march, the U.S. now found itself on the defensive. However, the war wasn't a total wash in the beginning. While the Army stumbled on land, the tiny U.S. Navy shocked the world at sea. The British Royal Navy was the undisputed ruler of the oceans, yet American frigates like the USS Constitution won stunning one-on-one duels against British ships. When British cannonballs bounced off the Constitution's thick oak hull during its victory over the HMS Guerriere, sailors nicknamed her Old Ironsides. These victories didn't change the strategic balance, but they provided a massive morale boost to a nation that desperately needed one. The tide of the war shifted dramatically in 1814. Napoleon was defeated in Europe and exiled. This was bad news for the United States. Britain could now take the thousands of battle-hardened veterans who had been fighting the French and send them across the Atlantic to deal with the Americans once and for all. The British plan was aggressive. They launched raids in the Chesapeake Bay, aiming for the heart of the American government. In August 1814, British troops marched on Washington, D.C. The American militia defending the capital were routed in a panic, famously mocked as the Bladensburg Races. Afterward, the British marched into Washington and set it on fire. Luckily for the Americans, a freak rainstorm and tornado, now nicknamed the storm that saved Washington, occurred and made some structures immune to the flames. However, the Capitol building and the White House were not among those and were summarily torched. First Lady Dolly Madison barely escaped, securing a famous portrait of George Washington before fleeing the city. Seeing the Capitol in flames was the lowest point of the war for the United States. It looked and felt like the grand experiment was failing.
But the British didn't stop there. They moved on to Baltimore, a crucial port city. But Baltimore was ready. American merchants sank their own private ships to block the harbor and fortify the city. For 25 hours, the British Navy bombarded Fort McHenry. From a ship in the harbor, an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched the shelling, certain that the fort would surrender. But when the sun rose the next morning, the flag was still there. He scribbled down the start of a poem on the back of a letter he had in his pocket, which he would complete a little while later. This poem would famously later become the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The British, unable to break the city, withdrew. The survival of Baltimore proved to be the turning point that the U.S. could not be easily conquered.
By late 1814, both sides were exhausted. The British treasury was empty from decades of war with France, and the American economy was crushed by British blockades. Peace negotiators met in Ghent, Belgium, to hammer out a treaty. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. The terms? Status quo ante bellum. That's Latin for the way things were before the war. No borders changed, no land was exchanged. The issues of impressment weren't even addressed in the text, though they became moot since the war with Napoleon was over. On paper, it looked like the war had achieved absolutely nothing. But news traveled slow in the 19th century. While the treaty was making its way across the Atlantic, the bloodiest battle of the war was just starting. The British had launched a massive campaign to seize New Orleans and control the Mississippi River. Waiting for them was General Andrew Jackson, commanding a ragtag army of Tennessee militia, Choctaw warriors, freed slaves, and even Baratarian pirates like Jean Lafitte. On January 8, 1815, the British launched a frontal assault on Jackson's earthworks. It was a slaughter. In less than an hour, the British suffered roughly 2,000 casualties. The Americans suffered fewer than 100. It was a lopsided, decisive victory. When news of New Orleans reached the rest of the country, followed shortly by news of the peace treaty, Americans conflated the two. It felt to many like they had won the war. So, what was the aftermath? Who actually won the War of 1812? If you look at the official scorecard, it's a draw. The British held Canada, the Americans held their sovereignty. But the real losers were the Native American nations. The death of Tecumseh in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames and the subsequent collapse of his Confederacy shattered the last unified resistance to American expansion in the Old Northwest. The way was now clear for white settlement to surge westward. For the United States, the war was a psychological victory. The country had faced down the world's greatest empire for a second time and survived. It also created a new generation of heroes, Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, who would ride their military fame all the way to the presidency. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, dissolved in disgrace. ushering in the so-called Era of Good Feelings. The War of 1812 once and for all proved that the United States was not just a temporary collection of colonies, but a permanent and sovereign nation. It was the moment the U.S. stopped looking east toward Britain and started looking west toward its own future. It may have been a clumsy, unnecessary, and confusing war, but it was the war that finally, truly secured American independence. Thanks for watching 1812, The Forgotten American War. And see you next time on Latchkey History.